Olá, pessoal. Tá todo mundo conseguindo me ouvir, me ver bem, tudo certo? Espero que estejam todos bem. Bom, acho que tá tudo certo, né? Bom, em primeiro lugar, boa tarde, né? Quase boa noite aí para todo mundo. Meu nome é Maria Visconti, eu sou uma das coordenadoras do NEPAT, o Núcleo Brasileiro de Estudos de Nazismo e Holocausto. Só um instante, ok? E esse é o nosso terceiro evento, no geral, nosso segundo evento online, denominado O Fardo dos Nossos Tempos, o Terceiro Reich em Perspectiva. Eu estou muito feliz de poder estar aqui, mais uma vez, abrindo, né, essas conferências dos nossos eventos, e só agradecer a todo mundo, né, que está aqui hoje assistindo também. A gente sabe que mais evento online, né, às vezes dá um pouco cansativo, mas que bom que vocês vieram, estamos muito felizes também com a nossa convidada. Só queria dar alguns avisos que as meninas do NEPAT, a Ana e a Bárbara, vão deixar aqui no chat o link para vocês se inscreverem e ganharem um certificado de ouvinte de 20 horas, tá? Se vocês quiserem, é claro, elas vão deixar o link aqui. E, bom, é isso, né? Estamos dando início aí ao nosso evento, vai durar a semana toda, temos muitas coisas muito legais acontecendo. E, bom, o evento internacional, O Fardo dos Nossos Tempos, o Terceiro Reich em Perspectiva, é mais uma iniciativa nossa, do NEPAT, totalmente discente, vai contar com conferências internacionais, tanto em inglês hoje, né, amanhã também, em espanhol, e muita coisa em português também, é claro, mesas redondas, mesas discentes, 2 minicursos, e o objetivo do evento é justamente refletir sobre as reverberações e as continuidades do nazismo nas sociedades atuais, investigando aí com principal, especial atenção às profundas raízes da ideologia nazista no Brasil. E também a gente quer pensar aí nas potencialidades e nos desafios de pesquisar e ensinar temas relacionados ao nazismo e ao Holocausto, né? Então, esse é o objetivo geral aí do nosso evento. A conferência de hoje vai ser realizada em inglês, e depois a gente vai ativar a opção de legendas automáticas do YouTube, né, para facilitar o acompanhamento da conferência, e nós vamos abrir para as perguntas após o término da fala da palestrante, mas as perguntas vocês podem ir enviando conforme ela for falando, pelo chat aqui do YouTube. Vocês podem mandar tanto em inglês quanto em português, tá? Não se preocupem que a gente vai repassar para ela, e aí no final da fala ela vai poder responder. Bom, a conferência de abertura de hoje se chama Lendo, mente, de Adolf Eichmann, Criminal Case 4061, de Harry Muslich, e será apresentada pela professora Erin McGlothlin, da Universidade de Washington, em St. Louis. A Erin vai examinar a representação dos perpetradores do Holocausto em obras que figuram a experiência interna dos perpetradores, decifrando suas motivações, suas emoções, ou seja, lendo sua mente, entre aspas. Assim, os perpetradores se tornam, então, sujeitos moralmente complexos e, acima de tudo, humanos. Compreendê-los, longe de exonerar suas ações, é essencial para a gente compreender a totalidade do Holocausto. E, ao se debruçar sobre essas representações, a Erin vai analisar as construções culturais sobre os perpetradores, levantando importantes questões históricas e éticas. Então, agora eu vou fazer a apresentação da convidada em inglês, tá? Para ela também não se sentir assim tão de fora da conferência, e aí vou abrir a fala para ela, tá bom? This event is yet another initiative produced by the coordinators of the Brazilian Center for Nazism and Holocaust Studies, and will feature international conference in Spanish and English, roundtables, study tables, and 2 short courses. The purpose of this event is to reflect on the repercussions and continuities of Nazism in current societies, to investigate with particular attention the deep roots of ideology in Brazil, and think about the challenges and potential of researching and teaching these topics, such as Nazism and the Holocaust. The opening conference, Mind Reading Adolf Eichmann, Harry Muslich Criminal Case, will be presented by Professor Erin McGlothlin from the Washington University in St. Louis. Erin will examine the depiction of Holocaust perpetrators in works that feature the perpetrators' inner experiences, deciphering their motivations and emotions, that is, reading their minds. Thus, perpetrators turn into a morally complex and, above all, human subjects. Understanding them, far from exonerating their actions, is essential to understanding the Holocaust fully. By looking at such representations, Erin will examine cultural constructions of perpetrators, raising important historical and ethical questions. Professor McGlothlin holds a degree in German letters from the University of Texas, Austin, and a MA and a PhD in German literature from the University of Virginia. She is currently a professor in the Germanic and Jewish Studies Department at Washington University in St. Louis, and her research interests revolve around Holocaust studies and Jewish studies, emphasizing German Jewish literature of the 20th and 21st centuries, as well as representations of the Holocaust perpetrators in literature and film. Erin, we are very happy and honored to present you today. Thank you so much again for accepting our invitation to be here today to talk to us. So please, you can talk.
I'll take the floor.
Yes, you can take the floor.
I'm going to share my screen. So let me just do that really quickly. So do we see it here? There it is. Yes. Okay, great. And first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers of NEPAT, Maria and her colleagues, for inviting me. It's really exciting for me to take a virtual trip to Brazil today. I woke up this morning, I'm in the United States, now I'm in Brazil and all over the world. And it's really lovely to be with all of you watching. The title of my talk is Mind Reading Adolf Eichmann, Harry Muslich's Criminal Case 4061. So, apart from Adolf Hitler, the single most thoroughly documented, painstakingly analyzed, and frequently represented perpetrator of the Holocaust has been Adolf Eichmann, the notorious mid-level SS bureaucrat who played a central logistical role in the deportation of Europe's Jews to the National Socialist ghettos and killing centers. By virtue not only of the copious testimony from his 1961 Israeli trial, but also of the thousands of pages of his autobiographical writing and transcripts of his exhaustive pretrial interrogation, there exists a massive Eichmann archive to which historians, social scientists, writers, and filmmakers can turn in pursuit of answers to their questions about the nature of the mind of the Holocaust perpetrator. Moreover, because of the global attention commanded by the spectacle of his trial, and on account of high-profile analysis of the proceedings, the most prominent of which, is Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil. Eichmann has become, in the words of David Cesarani, an icon of the 20th century, of the Nazi regime and the genocide it waged against the Jews. At the same time, however, Eichmann's extraordinary notoriety is perplexing, particularly given the characterization of him that has taken root in the public imagination as a result, above all, of Arendt's work, which declared him, quote, an average, normal person, neither feeble-minded, nor indoctrinated, nor cynical, end of quote. The notion of Eichmann's alleged normality, which Arendt enduringly inscribed into the global discourse on the Holocaust with her memorable designation, the banality of evil, thus reflects an apparent twofold paradox. Not only does the particular form of evil represented by Eichmann's diligent facilitation of the deportation process deviate radically, as Arendt argues, from conventional notions of criminal evildoing, but his abiding infamy is also at odds with his ordinariness, with his intermediate rank, and with the somewhat secondary, albeit not trivial, role that he played in the broader conceptualization and implementation of the Holocaust. Despite, or perhaps even because of these contradictions, Eichmann continues to fascinate both scholars and artists who continually and compulsively plumb the depths of his alleged normality, looking for answers to questions that resist easy clarification. Their collective attempt to read Eichmann results, as Kara Critchell and her co-editors argue, in an irreducibly complex web of representations, translations, and remediation. The extensive dialogue on Eichmann that has developed in the decades since his trial, which constituted a watershed moment for the revelation of the crimes of the Holocaust and one of the few public trials to feature direct testimony from a perpetrator, has had a profound and lasting effect on the discourse of National Socialism, such that one cannot even begin to speak about individual perpetrators without at least mentioning Eichmann. The worldwide televisual broadcast of the trial and the massive media coverage it galvanized firmly established through his case the quintessential archetype of Holocaust perpetration, namely the figure of the desk murderer, who generates and manages the extensive bureaucratic substructure of mass murder, but who is able to maintain a clean conscience by virtue of never committing a physically violent act himself. Cesarani credits the phenomenon of the Eichmann trial not only with establishing the prototype of the perpetrator of state-authorized industrial genocide, but also with signaling, quote, the birth of Holocaust studies, an unforeseen and oblique legacy of the trial, end of quote. The impact of the trial has also catalyzed in the intervening decades a surge of analyses of Eichmann that shows no signs of subsiding. In particular, the last 20 years have witnessed a boom in scholarly literature and popular representations that attempt to both clarify Eichmann's pivotal historical role in the Holocaust and to probe in particular the psychological and sociological dimensions of his crimes. The professed goal of the great majority of these depictions is to decipher from his testimony who Eichmann actually was and to develop interpretations of his personality, character, and psychological makeup. Such representations perform what cognitive psychologists call mind reading, which refers to the ways in which humans infer, attribute, and interpret the mental states of others on the basis of verbal, corporeal, and behavioral clues. In their efforts to explain how Eichmann, an allegedly average person, could become such a central figure in the perpetration of the Holocaust, textual and filmic representations and analyses attempt to mind read Eichmann in order to deduce his beliefs and attitudes regarding his crimes. In this way, over half a century after his execution in 1961, a flourishing literature continues to read Eichmann as a text that can still provide novel insights about the interiority of a man who played a core role in the systematic organization of genocide. Moreover, such representations posit Eichmann as the paradigmatic perpetrator, placing him at the very center of post-Holocaust attempts to understand the minds of the men who perpetrated the Holocaust. The figure of Eichmann is thus fundamental to the history of perpetrator representation. Just as one cannot speak about Holocaust perpetrators without referring to Eichmann, one can likewise not discuss the Eichmann phenomenon without also mentioning Hannah Arendt and her extremely influential study of Eichmann. The importance of Arendt's impact on the development of the discourse on Eichmann's mind over the last decades cannot be overstated. Indeed, most of the recent wave of scholarly works and artistic representations that attempt to mind read Eichmann assume as their basic orientation point her interpretation, which tackles the concept of evil, a category that is unquestionably central to the discussion of Holocaust perpetration. Indeed, Eichmann in Jerusalem comprises, above all, an inquiry into the dynamics of representation. In particular, Arendt grapples with how to locate, define, and interpret the particular variant of evil associated with Eichmann's crimes, and how to render a model of his mind that would reconcile the indisputably maleficent quality of his role in the Holocaust with his character, which Arendt believes was incompatible with conventional notions of evil. Eichmann, she argues, was not a monster, not Iago and not Macbeth, as especially the Israeli prosecutor Gideon Hausner deliberately portrayed him, but rather he was an average, rather unexceptional man of his own historical moment. In Arendt's view, Eichmann's mentality was characterized by, quote, self-deception, lies, and stupidity, end of quote, by, quote, an inability to think, namely to think from the standpoint of somebody else, end of quote, and by a reliance on empty jargon and Baroque linguistic formulations that serve to disguise the absence of and function as proxy for cognitive and ethical depth. In its sheer thoughtlessness, Eichmann's mind thus reflected what Arendt terms, quote, the systematic mendacity that had constituted the general and generally accepted atmosphere of the Third Reich, end of quote. He was, as Arendt characterizes him, profoundly superficial and unrelentingly banal. As I've indicated, Arendt's reading of Eichmann's mind has substantially shaped contemporary discourse on Eichmann in particular and perpetrators in general. As Cesarani writes, ironically, Eichmann in Jerusalem, more than the trial itself, shaped Eichmann's legacy. Anyone writing on the subject today works in the shadow of Hannah Arendt. To be sure, scholars, particularly Cesarani, disagree vehemently about whether Arendt, with her famous banality thesis, was correct in her assessment of the historical Eichmann. As the eminent Holocaust historian Christopher Browning writes, for the record, let me state that I consider Arendt's concept of the banality of evil a very important insight for understanding many of the perpetrators of the Holocaust, but not Eichmann himself. Arendt was fooled by Eichmann's strategy of self-representation in part because there were so many perpetrators of the kind he was pretending to be. While I want to acknowledge the ongoing scholarly dialogue about the aptness of Arendt's portrait of Eichmann, my intention here, however, is not to rehash well-established arguments or to take sides in the debate about the historical applicability of her thesis. Instead, I wish to shift the question about whether Arendt was correct or not in her assessment of Eichmann to the issue of cultural mediation and interpretation. In other words, I'd like to concentrate on how and through what means Eichmann's mind has been inferred and represented in post-Holocaust culture. In doing so, I wish to decenter Arendt slightly in my examination of the cultural mediation of Eichmann, for however much we may be overshadowed by or in perpetual dialogue with Eichmann in Jerusalem, it is important to note that influential readings of Eichmann's mentality precede the publication and immediate notoriety of Arendt's text. In my recent book, The Mind of the Holocaust Perpetrator in Fiction and Nonfiction, I find it fruitful to situate Arendt's 1963 assessment alongside two other notable biographical portraits that emerged from his trial and that appeared shortly afterward. Harry Muslich's 1962 Desac 4061, a reportage, which appeared in English translation in 2005 as Criminal Case 4061, The Trial of Adolf Eichmann, an Eyewitness Account, and William L. Hull's 1963, The Struggle for a Soul. While I will focus only on the former text in my talk today, in the extended chapter on these texts in my book, I demonstrate how the depictions of Eichmann by Arendt, Muslich, and Hull show radically disparate perspectives on his mind, thereby creating a kaleidoscopic lens through which they collectively filter his self-presentation and providing a fascinating glimpse into how Eichmann's crimes, his persona, and his performance of identity function in different ways for different interpreters. Attending the Eichmann trial at the same time as Arendt, and likely even sitting beside her in the courtroom when the indictment was read, was Harry Muslich, a Dutch novelist and intellectual who would go on to become one of the most important post-war writers in the Netherlands. Like Arendt, Muslich was not a journalist, but he was asked to cover the trial as a correspondent for the prominent Dutch weekly magazine Elsevier's Weekblad. Further, he, like Arendt, saw his assignment as an unparalleled opportunity to probe questions about the legacy of Nazi crimes in the Second World War, a topic that remained the abiding intellectual and artistic preoccupation of his life. Muslich collected his published articles about the trial, along with diary entries from the period, and published them as a book in 1962. After Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem appeared a year later, first as a series of articles in the New Yorker and then as a book, Muslich sent Arendt a copy of the German translation of his book, noting that he was, quote, struck by the resemblance in the theory Arendt had unfolded, end of quote. 2 weeks later, Arendt replied to Muslich, agreeing that she, quote, too was struck by the resemblance in approach and theory, end of quote, and that she planned to include quotes from his book in the German translation of hers. In the English language postscript to her book, Arendt further writes that, quote, Harry Muslich is almost the only writer on the subject to put the person of the defendant at the very center of his report, and whose evaluation of Eichmann coincides with my own on some essential points, end of quote. Like Arendt, Muslich did not interact personally with Eichmann. Both writers were thus forced by necessity to base their accounts exclusively on their observations and interpretations of his physical demeanor, behavior, and statements at the trial, and on their reading of the documents. As a result, their accounts, as Arendt indicates, correspond in striking ways. Both writers consider the larger phenomenon of the trial and the role it played in shaping Israeli Holocaust consciousness and the transnational discourse on Nazi crimes and Jewish suffering in the Holocaust. Further, they both are keenly aware of the theatrical character of the trial. To be sure, unlike Arendt, who contextualizes Eichmann's character within a larger inquiry into questions of justice, the complex nature of the National Socialist bureaucracy, and Eichmann's role in it, and the complicity of the Jewish ghetto councils, among other aspects, Muslich more extensively explores the person and personality of Eichmann. At the same time, however, both writers actively attempt to grapple with the ironic tensions between Eichmann's apparent ordinariness, the crimes for which he was being tried, and the sensational way in which he was being portrayed at the trial and in the press as diabolically evil. Indeed, the Eichmann both Arendt and Muslich encountered in the courtroom was somewhat of a buffoon. Arendt writes, quote, despite all efforts of the prosecution, everybody could see that this man was not a monster, but it was difficult indeed not to suspect that he was a clown, end of quote. And Muslich claims at the conclusion of the trial, quote, not an apotheosis, not a genesis of a god would have been right for him, but more an apocolosynthesis, which Seneca once dedicated to Emperor Claudius, the genesis of a pumpkin, end of quote. Further, Arendt's and Eichmann's books partially converge in their conclusions about the unprecedented character of the evil that Eichmann represented. Arendt sees in Eichmann, quote, a new type of criminal, end of quote, stresses his thoughtlessness and the modality of his language, motives, and self-understanding, and notes that he was the obverse of conventional notions of evil. Muslich similarly attempts to pin down Eichmann's normality and his divergence from historical and cultural models of evil. He emphasizes Eichmann's smallness and argues that he was, quote, not an antichrist or a Genghis Khan, end of quote. Indeed, according to Muslich, Eichmann represented not only a new kind of criminal, but, quote, a different human being, end of quote, whose language, which he termed, quote, the lingo of the tax form and of the written record multiplied to insanity, end of quote, revealed him to be, quote, not so much a human being in trouble as a whirling machine having lost its engineer, end of quote. Muslich's characterization of Eichmann with the metaphor of the automaton set into perpetual motion, quote, a rational tool set up to execute any command whatsoever without comment, end of quote, resonates with Arendt's characterization of his, quote, inability to think, namely to think from the standpoint of somebody else, end of quote. Like a machine whose sole purpose is to embody the function to which it is dedicated, Eichmann, Muslich writes midway through the trial, quote, could no more step out of his skin than could a crematorium, which obeyed a specific purpose, end of quote. Eichmann's thoughtless, unmodified automatic thinking and his, quote, administrative pedantry, end of quote, as revealed in the courtroom testimony, demonstrated his continued identification with the role he had enjoyed during the Third Reich, when, according to Arendt, quote, he and the world he lived in had once been in perfect harmony, end of quote. In this way, Muslich and Arendt render analogous depictions of Eichmann's mind. For Arendt, Eichmann expressed, quote, the essence of totalitarian government, end of quote, whose object was to transform men like him into workable instruments of a greater administrative mechanism. By virtue of his total identification with the authority of this machinery, he considered himself to the end, quote, a law-abiding citizen who acted upon orders, end of quote, not out of personal inclination, but out of a sense of duty. For Muslich, in turn, Eichmann was not only the, quote, calm, dutiful civil servant who transports the European Jews to Rudolf Höss's gas chambers, end of quote, he also functioned more broadly as the, quote, ideal of psychotechnology, end of quote, in the modern age, a mechanical, quote, medium without belief or hypnosis, end of quote, who carried out an order purely because it must be, quote, obeyed, no matter where it is coming from, end of quote. Despite their similarities, however, obvious and essential differences exist between Arendt's and Muslich's accounts, due chiefly to the particularity of their authors' respective intellectual perspectives. Arendt was a philosopher, while Muslich was a novelist, and the generic framing of their reports. Although Muslich shares with Arendt keen analytical observations and penetrative insight, his book, Sanderbax argues, quote, is a complex hybrid text that contains elements of journalism, essays, philosophy, and literature at the same time, end of quote. Muslich thus employs a degree of novelistic license in Criminal Case 4061, which allows for perspectives not available to Arendt's purely analytical method, particularly when it comes to inferring and interpreting Eichmann's mind. Moreover, while Arendt wrote the entirety of her report in the last half of 1962, a year after the conclusion of the trial and shortly after Eichmann's execution, most of the chapters that appear in Muslich's book were written during the trial as articles or diary entries. For this reason, his book reads not as a global analytical report written from the hindsight of a posterior vantage point, but as an ongoing summative attempt to grapple in deeply personal ways with Eichmann as the trial plays out in real time. In his short preface to Criminal Case 4061, Muslich writes, quote, 4061 is the number of the Eichmann case on the roll of the District Court of Jerusalem. In this volume, I give the account of an experience behind this number. An experience is different from a train of thought. It is subject to change. At the end, one finds a different person, partly with different thoughts from at the beginning. Since the account of this changing experience is announced in the first entry, I have not made any corrections anywhere. This was not supposed to be a book about Eichmann, but to remain the double report it was intended from the start, end of quote. Muslich depicts his coverage of the trial as a metamorphic personal experience and his engagement with the figure of Eichmann as a profound intersubjective encounter, even though he never met or interacted with the man himself. Rather than distance himself from Eichmann by virtue of sardonic hindsight and a sophisticated analytical framework, as Arendt arguably is able to do, Muslich draws himself closer to him, developing a paradoxical empathy with him as he watches him endure the trial. As Muslich writes in September 1961, after the conclusion of the trial, but before the verdict was read, quote, The Eichmann case is more about me than I know myself, and this connection goes farther than a thematic link with other work that I have written or will write. He is one of the 2 or 3 people who have changed me. Above all, he has cured me of many things, of indignation without obligation, for example, but also of much carefreeness. He has also taught me a certain vigilance. My eyes have opened a little wider. I see him, myself, as well as others, in a brighter light. What is remarkable here is that the outlines have become more blurred. The boundaries between him and me are lapsing." End of quote. Muslich's engagement with the figure of Eichmann not only triggers an uncomfortable, empathetic disposition, but also generates new modes of viewing both the object of his study and himself. His reference to the act of seeing with regard to his encounter with the Eichmann trial is not entirely metaphorical. In fact, his book not only features his analysis of Eichmann's character, but is also replete with detailed descriptions of his own visual perceptions of Eichmann, particularly Eichmann's face. For example, early on in the trial, he writes, "Today the courtroom is half empty, and to observe him well, I go sit in the front row, 10 feet away from him. Then I have a good view of his eyes. People here wrote that he has snake eyes, Francois, and also that each of his eyes is a gas chamber, Liberation. But in truth, they are soft and somewhat velvety, which is only more horrifying. Sometimes they suddenly shoot sideways in some sort of tick. Then his head shudders for a moment and he sucks his cheeks in, which makes him pull his mouth to the left. In moments like these, he is somewhat like the Eichmann we would like to see, an inexplicably merciless face sending shivers up my spine, a shattered face simultaneously evoking strong pity." End of quote. Focusing on his face and eyes, Muslich attempts to divine from his countenance who Eichmann is and what he thinks. At times, Muslich concedes, Eichmann conforms to the, quote, "image of Satan that the press has created out of him in the last few months," end of quote. At the same time, however, Muslich argues that Eichmann is irreducibly mortal. Quote, "He turns out to be human, a somewhat grubby man with a cold, wearing glasses," end of quote. Eichmann's appearance thus embodies for Muslich the paradox that his character posed at the trial. As he writes of himself and his fellow journalists, quote, "Slowly everybody here is becoming schizophrenic about Eichmann. We know what he did, although it still has to be proven, but in the cage we see a lonely, dying man," end of quote. With this keen focus on Eichmann's facial features and expressions and what they reveal about his character, Muslich pursues in his articles and diary entries a particular variant of the cognitive operation of mind reading, grounded chiefly in the interpretation of a person's face and other physical features. This manner of mind reading through perception of the body and face is related to the Enlightenment era science of physiognomy, or the systematic study of the correspondence of psychological characteristics to facial features or body structure. Physiognomic theory of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, according to Rochelle Reeves, quote, "predicates the expressive strength of the face on its ability to consolidate the interior and exterior dimensions of the human subject," end of quote. As Richard Gray explains, it involves, quote, "the hermeneutic reconstitution of the internal character, desires, and dispositions of human beings based on the interpretation of the body as a system of meaningful signs," end of quote. Although physiognomy was deemed well into the 20th century an objective methodology by many of its proponents, from a contemporary perspective, it is better understood as an interpretive cultural practice embedded in particular historical contexts. For this reason, it is conventionally presumed an essential link between appearance, psychology, and morality that has often been deployed to construct and support hegemonic, racist, sexist, ableist, and classist ideologies and theories of criminality. While the problematic determinate relationship between outer characteristics and inner character posited by physiognomy has been largely discredited by current science, the practice of physiognomic interpretation, or what both Ellen Spolsky and Guillaume Bolens call kinesic intelligence, persists as a cognitive process on the level of individuals who routinely make judgments, often incorrectly and from a heavily biased perspective, about their fellow human beings based on the largely unconscious meanings they assign to facial and bodily features. Moreover, such physiognomic practices are also at play in cultural texts that simulate the ways in which real-life individuals engage in bodily interpretation. They comprise the textual conventions not only of fiction, where narrators and characters infer a figure's interiority from his or her physical characteristics, but also of journalistic portraits and other genres of nonfiction, whereby the author attempts to convey some aspect of the subject's inner life by describing his or her outer appearance. Particularly nonfiction associated with the new journalism of the 60s and 70s, to which Mulich's text has often been attributed, which fuses factual reporting with novelistic techniques and which foregrounds rather than effaces the author's subjective interpretation, utilizes what I term kinesic mind reading. In their attempt to render the inner character of their subjects by describing their facial and bodily features, such texts often self-consciously draw attention to the writer's cognitive and emotional process of interpreting the human subjects under investigation through acts of kinesic mind reading. As indicated by Mulich's reference to the ways in which journalists interpreted Eichmann's eyes, narrative recourse to strategies of kinesic mind reading is particularly ubiquitous in the numerous non-fictional assessments of Adolf Eichmann that appeared during and after his 1961 trial, which are based not on personal interaction with Eichmann himself, but on either firsthand observation or photographs and televisual footage of Eichmann's behavior during the trial. These portraits attempt to reconcile the public image of him disseminated in the media before the trial began, which sensationally characterized him as the embodiment of evil, with the rather mundane demeanor of the man seated in the glass box in the courtroom. Such attempts at kinesic mind reading are particularly characteristic of Arendt, who describes Eichmann, quote, as medium-sized, slender, middle-aged, with receding hair, ill-fitting teeth, and nearsighted eyes, who throughout the trial keeps craning his scraggy neck toward the bench. Not once does he face the audience, and who desperately and for the most part successfully maintains his self-control despite the nervous tic to which his mouth must have become subject long before this trial started, end of quote. With her description of his facial and bodily features, Arendt portrays Eichmann as physically weak, cagey, desperate, and comically mediocre, a depiction that she then compounds with her interpretation of his banality. More recently, Mariana Torgovnik, in her 2005 analysis of Eichmann's appearance in iconic images from his trial, both interrogates and confirms the operation of kinesic mind reading as a reliable source of knowledge about Eichmann's character. Quote, the pictures. Eichmann's transformation began, I believe, with the pictures. In televised images and in passport-sized magazine close-ups, Eichmann's face appeared over and over again, looking not commanding or toweringly arrogant, but nondescript. Thin face with sunken cheeks. Some lines, though not deep or dramatic. Sparse hair sticking up and patted down occasionally by the self-conscious defendant. Middle-aged, Middle European. Ordinary eyes, ordinary build, ordinary though thin and sharp, nose, ordinary glasses. Ordinary. Except for the mouth, which looked peculiar, like a hole, or alternately like a twitch or a grimace. The status of Eichmann's false teeth may seem trivial. but trivia can influence the way that visual images help to shape public memory and even history. Grotesque in its mobility, Eichmann's mouth suggests a man who had developed a facial tic long before the trial began. Knowing this man to have been a Nazi who helped to organize the murder of millions, we cannot help but see guilt at work, or perhaps frustration. Either way, the man looks at once sinister, but also ridiculous and contemptible. End of quote. As Arendt's and Torgovnit's quotes demonstrate, our cultural image of Eichmann as simultaneously mundane, ridiculous, and grotesque, in other words, as both commonplace and exceptionally evil, has originated, at least in part, in attempts to discern his character from analyses of his face. Muslich brilliantly performs the binary between the malevolent and the mundane embodied by Eichmann's appearance, and at the same time deconstructs it in his article from the trial entitled The Two Faces of Eichmann, and written in March 1961, a month before the trial commenced, when global speculation about Eichmann's character and motives was at its peak. His article performs a study of Eichmann's face by concentrating on a photo, this figure, of Eichmann taken in 1960, shortly after his capture in Argentina by the Israeli secret police, which presents half of his face bathed in light and the other half cast in shadow and thus distorted. However, rather than simply interpret this photo of Eichmann's face as a source for reliable knowledge about his character, Muslich proposes to conduct a thought experiment, or what he calls a little trick, by bisecting the photo lengthwise through Eichmann's face and constructing from the two divided parts two additional images, each of which is composed of one half of the original image and its mirror opposite. So you can see that in figures 2 and 3. One of the resulting images, figure 2, presents Eichmann as fully illuminated, while the other, figure 3, displays him fully shadowed. With these two manufactured photos, which he tells us are, quote, portraits of men who have never existed and who never will, end of quote, Muslich thus makes manifest the dualism that characterizes the public discourse on Eichmann's character. Moreover, the fictional status of these portraits, and thus of Muslich's mental exercise, is marked by the obvious line that runs down the middle of both fabricated photographs, which emphasizes the artificial sutures that created these two fictional men. Muslich's initial interpretation of these two fabricated images follows conventional physiognomic interpretation, which associates even, harmonious features with psychic consonance and a distorted exterior with interior deformation. Quote, the first impulse is, that is the real Eichmann, figure 3, the barbaric, twisted mug of the mass murderer. Figure 2, on the other hand, is very human, a calm face, serious eyes, and a glimmer of a smile around his mouth, end of quote. However, rather than follow his first impulse and regard these fabricated images as respectively embodying Eichmann, the ordinary human, and Eichmann, the Antichrist, Muslich quickly questions this, quote, simple interpretation, end of quote. Quote, do modern murders really have such frighteningly distorted faces, end of quote? Muslich answers this question in the negative. The face in figure 3, Muslich reasons, does not really resemble the actual Eichmann, whose likeness is rather to be found in figure 2, a factor that, quote, undermines the theory that 2 is the human and 3 is the beast, end of quote. Moreover, the horridly disfigured face exhibited in figure 3 cannot be seen as embodying the essence of Eichmann's crimes, for Eichmann's transgressions were not that of the conventional evildoer, a figure that, according to our physiognomic expectations, should resemble the horrific face in figure 3, but rather that of what Muslich terms the mechanical order receptor, a fully modern murderer whose lack of conscience leaves his face unlined and grimace-free. Reading against the grain of conventional physiognomic interpretation, which attributes to a grotesque appearance an equally malformed mental and moral state, Muslich sees the pleasant, more human face presented in figure 2 as more fittingly emblematic of Eichmann, the technological bureaucrat of genocide, while the face featured in figure 3 reminds him rather of a Buchenwald survivor he met while touring the site of the former concentration camp. Quote, "The man who showed me around was the spitting image of figure 3, except his nose was smashed in addition. He was not an ex-camp bully, but one of the oldest prisoners. At the start of Buchenwald in 1938, he was brought in as a communist. He had been through everything." End of quote. In the survivor's face, and thus in its likeness in figure 3, Muslich sees the physical manifestation of the violence the man endured during his time as a prisoner. In Mulich's view, the face in figure 3, like the one in figure 2, thus functions as a physiognomic archive of the crimes of the Holocaust. However, while the face in figure 2 is a record of the commission of those crimes, the one in figure 3 is the vestige of their effects. Proposing a much more nuanced reading of these two photographs, Muslich writes further, quote, "I believe we will be getting closer to the truth if we see the witness in figure 3. Figure 3 is the face that sees what the man in figure 2 does. Figure 2 is the slick, unmoved, merciless face of the killer. Figure 3 is the face that observes the killing, filled with horror. Or, if figure 2 is Eichmann, then figure 3 is the face of the world watching him at work." End of quote. Muslich continues, quote, "Returning to Eichmann's real face, the right-hand side is the part on which his crimes have had an effect, the side of the heart. The left-hand side is the part that committed the crimes." End of quote. With the active physiognomic or kinesic mind reading made possible by his little trick, Muslich thus not only bisects Eichmann's photo, but also bifurcates the figure of Eichmann himself, characterizing the half that appears serene and impassive as the identity of the perpetrator, whose face betrays no signs of mental disquiet for the crimes he has undertaken, while the twisted side is relegated to the victim, whose ruined face testifies to and is permanently maimed by the perception of his crimes. It thus functions as a living document of tormented horror. In this way, Muslich reads the grotesque right-hand side of Eichmann's face not as indicative of the sort of evil that disfigurement conventionally connotes in physiognomic thinking, but rather as evidence of Eichmann's atrophied conscience, which silently observes but does not intervene in the genocidal crimes committed by its untroubled, obedient doppelganger. With his counterintuitive reading of Eichmann's face made possible by his partition of the pretrial photograph, Muslich thus creatively adopts and ironically transforms the textual conventions of much of the media coverage of the trial, which attempted to construct Eichmann's nefarious interiority through acts of kinesic mind reading. The paradox of this practice and the images it produces becomes the leitmotif of Muslich's entire text. By virtue of its disruption of conventional associations of physical harmony with goodness and distortion with evil, Muslich continually reminds himself and the reader of the ways in which Eichmann and his crimes negate the traditional moral and juridical categories and the seemingly intuitive association between aesthetics and ethics. At the same time, however, Muslich's exercise in kinesic mind reading does not remain static throughout his coverage at the trial. Rather, at the end of criminal case 4061, he returns to Eichmann's face and reevaluates his introductory reading of it. In an article written less than a week after the trial adjourned, he writes, quote, "After spending 398 hours in his capsule, Eichmann disappeared in the wall. probably to come back out only for the verdict. Anyone who has seen Eichmann on TV these last few weeks realizes that he was looking into the face of a man who has practically gone insane. The eyes, the mouth, the entire face is a constant, shivering, pulling motion, but never does so much as an expression form on it. Every separate motion is senseless. No motion is connected to another. The man has been shattered into 1,000 pieces. This is emphasized by the total immobility of the rest of his body. This is what happens to a human being who is elevated to the devil. The motions in his face are not indicative that the horrendousness of his crimes has finally sunk in, but of the fact that nothing is sinking in. Really, this man is being punished. I cannot say that he does not deserve it, or that I am delighted. It is hideous, first and foremost. End of quote. Here, Muslich adds a third face to the two he divines from his reconstitution of Eichmann's portrait. Alongside the serene face of the killer and the horrified witness to his crimes is another physiognomic manifestation, that of the defendant who, over the long course of the trial, is continually compelled to embody a kind of absolute evil that is at odds with his own self-understanding and the commission of and motives for his crimes. After all, as Muslich writes toward the end of the trial, quote, "Something was being done to him that he had never expected. He was being turned into a myth. I do not believe that this has ever happened in world history to someone who was less mythical in character," end of quote. Moreover, the erratic, disconnected movements of Eichmann's face, as described by Muslich, signify neither his moral awareness of his crimes, nor even his recognition of them as crimes. In other words, they do not indicate the kind of growing realization and acknowledgement on the part of the criminal that the trial was intended to engender. Rather, they constitute meaningless automatic tics that do not coalesce into an expression, namely a legible countenance or body language. What the pressures to personify evil do, according to Muslich, is shatter Eichmann's face as a coherent, intelligible text, making it no longer accessible to conventional practices of kinesic mind reading. Muslich thus suggests here that Eichmann's crimes, behavior, and character not only supersede our conventional categories of evil, but also immobilize the very diagnostic tools we have developed to detect and interpret them as such. In this, Muslich's conclusions parallel the assessment of Jean-François Lyotard, who famously likened the aftermath of the Holocaust to a geological disaster. Quote, "Suppose that an earthquake destroys not only lives, buildings, and objects, but also the instruments used to measure earthquakes directly and indirectly. The impossibility of quantitatively measuring it does not prohibit, but rather inspires in the minds of the survivors the idea of a great seismic force. With Auschwitz, something new has happened in history, which can only be a sign and not a fact, which is that the facts, the testimonies which bore the traces of heres and nows, the documents which indicated the sense or senses of the facts, and the names, finally, the possibility of various kinds of phrases whose conjunction makes reality, all this has been destroyed as much as possible," end of quote. In Muslich's view, much like Lyotard's preternatural earthquake, whose force is so great that it disables conventional methods for registering its scope or making sense of it, Eichmann's crimes and his relationship to them incapacitate established frames of reference for criminality and culpability. Conventional practices of mind reading thus prove impotent to generate the sort of meaningful account of the kind of criminal Eichmann constituted and the circumstances that catalyzed his willing and eager commission of genocide. As Eichmann writes in a diary entry from the beginning of the trial with regard to the Israeli prosecutor Hausner, who still seemed to believe that Eichmann's mind was apprehensible, quote, he apparently still believes in an explanation, while in the same breath speaks of breaking through the window of human logic. Behind this reality, there is no more explanation. It is in itself an explanation of what man is. It is the final word thus far. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Erin, for this amazing presentation and class and everything. It was amazing to hear you. We have a couple of questions from people from the audience. The first one, I would like to ask you if you see, for instance, Zygmunt Bauman's work on modernity and the Holocaust. How do you see this inserted in this discussion on perpetrators and mind-reading perpetrators?
Well, certainly, I mean, Arendt herself really signaled this notion that modernity creates a different kind of crime and a different kind of perpetrator of the crime. And I think that, part of, that was, whether or not Eichmann was banal, going back to Arendt, what she was looking to describe was the ways in which someone can find their purpose within a greater modern administrative machinery and still have the self-understanding that they're moral. And rather than sort of that conversion of the Macbeth or the Iago, where you actually, you commit yourself to evil and you understand that's what you're doing, even if you believe it's necessary. And I think that moving toward this really confounds us. And of course, I wouldn't argue that this is any of this analysis is applicable to all perpetrators. I think we're finding that perpetrators are much more individualized. They have various motions, degrees of indoctrination, degrees of belief in anti-Semitism. They find themselves in different circumstances. But certainly, we really see here a post-war attempt to kind of return to these kind of pre-Holocaust frames of reference that would help us to label what we see. And at the same time, we're, and this is where I think the resistance to Arendt was so great. We want to be able to condemn these perpetrators, but we don't have the language yet for them. And it's very difficult for us to sort of order them into kind of a binary of good and evil that, structures a lot of Western thought. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, actually jumping into what you just mentioned, we have a question about how do you see this study, if we can maybe expand this for the perception of other perpetrators. How do you see this possibility?
Well, for me, and this is really a lot of what my book is about, is that what we know about perpetrators is really about the stories we tell about perpetrators. So there are the perpetrators and the narratives we tell, and the perpetrators exist in the narrative. So we have to look at the narrative frameworks and the assumptions and the ways in which we read the perpetrators to get to our understanding. I mean, people can interpret Eichmann in different ways, but we're still bringing our own ideological and in this case, very sometimes unconscious biases to our interpretations. And we want to acknowledge that like that's the closest we can get, that we ourselves, our portraits of perpetrators are how we understand them, tell us as much about ourselves as they do about the perpetrators.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. I have one question that I was thinking when I was listening to you, because currently I am researching the Nuremberg trials, as you know, and I have been reading Leon Goldenson and Gustav Gilbert's analysis on the Nazis in the Nuremberg trials, and they are both psychiatrists and psychologists. And I would like to ask, how do you see this proposal of mind reading these people in a way that, for instance, you mentioned they were looking at Eichmann and making assumptions, but the psychologists and psychiatrists, they were talking to them, but also making assumptions. So how do you see this proposal?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, particularly in the sense of Goldenson and Gilbert, because, you know, the Allies recognized that they made assumptions, and the assumptions were being made as early as 1933, but definitely, after the start of the war, and then as the war went on, that there was something pathological about Nazism, psychologically pathological, that not just as a society that, which, Arendt would have said that that's true of totalitarian society in general, but about individuals, that we can trace, whether Eichmann was, nursed by his mother long enough, or when he, his father first punished him, or that, those things would be found in the individuals. And so it's telling that some of the first people who had access to the defendants in Nuremberg were psychologists and psychoanalysts and psychiatrists who were attempting to make a link between what the men did and their psychic history. And I think that in some ways it's very modern, right? It's using the psychology as a discipline, psychiatry as an expertise, as a medical expertise, to try to understand these men. But at the same time, it shows to me that we were really still looking at largely individual psychic mechanisms for understanding perpetration. And we weren't yet ready to think about the collective social and cultural factors at work. So I think we can historicize even that moment too, right? That was the understanding of how let's send some psychiatrists in there to figure out where these men went wrong, what in their past made them, and how, and what their current pathologies are, rather than, really looking at the ways in which the men's understanding of what they did is very tied up in the social conditions of perpetration. And I think, going back to Browning, that idea of the social conditions and the ways in which the individual is constantly in negotiation with the group, I think that's a much more contemporary way of thinking about it. Although I shouldn't say that in particular, people like Adorno were thinking about that in the late 40s and 50s as well. But certainly in the historiography of the Holocaust, we were so much more interested in these perpetrators as individuals, and what their individual psychologies could tell us. So that, I think, is one reason why Eichmann became so important, is somehow it was he as a person was supposed to explain why this huge genocide had happened. And that could, as Muslich says, that was a crushing weight for Eichmann to be represented as that myth, to have to stand in for the entire perpetration of the Holocaust.
Yes, and also this way of thinking that they are very different from us, right? Since they have the psychology that's different. So
yeah, that's right. It's easier to kind of separate the us from them.
Yes,
you're able to psychologize and pathologize the them, and I think that the assumption that I think these psychiatrists went in there with was that there was something pathological, that these were not psychologically normal human beings.
Yeah, because they could not be, right?
Yeah, how could they be? Right.
How could they be? Yeah. So Barbara actually has a question. She said, you mentioned this notion of evil is a non-contest concept present in efforts to mind-read Eichmann. Has it been contested in later representations?
I guess. Yeah. I think that's a good question, and we're still trying to grapple with what does even evil mean? When I tried to sit down and think about this, I have a real hard time understanding, because it's kind of a code word for a lot of things, but it's not really very descriptive. I mean, we describe characters on television shows as evil, right? We like to have evil characters. Like, in fact, literature is our best, as Arendt points out, our sort of best model for what evil is. And I think, people are trying to understand what it means to be everyday evil. And that is, I think, in the last 20 years with what we call the new perpetrator research, it's to think about evil not as a radical category, as a category of that's ineffable or that's even metaphysical, as a metaphysical category, right? And it's metaphysical because, of course, Satan is evil. So it's not human. Rather to see evil as our attempt to label actions that are so violent and so past, our moral and ethical frameworks that we grasp at these ineffable concepts to try to label it. And I think that, Arendt really showed us we have to be careful of throwing this word evil around. And I think Muslich shows us as well. And I think since then, there definitely has been attempts to kind of be a little bit more careful with the word evil. But it crops up everywhere, even in Holocaust studies, because we only possess the language we have, and we only possess the categories we have. And at some points, it really is hard to kind of wrap your head around, people who somebody like Eichmann, who knows what is happening to hundreds of thousands of people, and feels like that's a job well done if he's able to deport them, even if it means to their death, because of course he didn't order their death. All he did was order the trains. And I think there is something that we recognize as human beings that feels ineffably evil about that. And I think Holocaust studies is constantly trying to define this, because we as humans are still trying to wrap our heads around it. It's not a crime of passion. It's not a crime of convenience. It's not a crime of greed. It's some kind of crime of thoroughness, and of conviction, that everything that you've learned in your moral education is wrong, and you're going to go against that, and yet still feel good about yourself. And I think that that's one of the reasons why this word evil still is in our Holocaust studies vocabulary, because we're still trying to kind of figure out what it means.
Yeah, the language plays a giant role here, right?
Yeah, it's interesting when you write a book on this, you're always trying to find synonyms for evil, and we don't have that many. Evil is evil. It's like some of these really major emotions and states like love, there's not that many synonyms for love. Love is love. We know love when we see it, and it feels like we know evil when we see it, but it's such a broad category, and it doesn't work in the same ways that it does in pre-Holocaust thought.
Yeah. There's another really good question here that Muslich makes an effort to observe and describe Eichmann's physiognomy during this trial. We often see cultural projects associate ugliness with villainy or evilness. So in your studies, have you encountered this type of association in descriptions or representations of perpetrators? Or is it the opposite? Are perpetrators represented as normal or human?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I think that binary is within us all. In fact, I would say in our very visual culture right now, it's even probably stronger, right? Because we know about beautiful people in photos, and people are constantly touching up photos. Like we're very aware of the power of aesthetically pleasing, and it is something that we tend culturally. And I don't want to make broad, generalizations, but we tend to associate that with the good. And you do see this in other attempts to understand perpetrators. So I'm thinking in particular of Gitta Sereny and her analysis of the Treblinka commandant Franz Stangl in the book Into That Darkness, where Sereny says, Stangl was a genteel, middle-class, soft-spoken, well-mannered man. And she wanted to talk to him because he was all of those things, right? He made a good impression. And she felt like that automatically signaled a higher morality than did, more crass perpetrators who maybe didn't, speak high German or express themselves in a more educated language. And she saw those people as being more naturally, have a natural inclination to perpetration. So in a sense, she wanted to believe, to understand Stangl because of his self-presentation as an aesthetically pleasing person. And I think that, I haven't done a lot of research on, that binary between ugly and good looking, but certainly, even survivor testimony, say of SS guards or of Mengele, note how well they were turned out, how handsome they were, their uniforms clean, they were standing up straight. There's this sense that they were aesthetically pleasing, and therefore, it was shocking that they behaved in such abominable ways. So I do think that it's part of a kind of a higher hardwiring in human psychology, and that it's an assumption we just bring with us into. And I'm thinking, for example, of Schindler's List. Rafe Fiennes, he's seen in the scene where he's shooting at the inmates at the Plaszow camp from his villa, and he's got this big gut, and he's looking he's not looking like the handsome man that we know Rafe Fiennes to be. He's looking grotesque in a way, and that somehow that embodies his behavior, that he's behaving in such a grotesque way.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Anna also asks here, when studying the Nazi regime, one of the biggest challenges is understanding and relating ourselves to this reality where ordinary men, such as Eichmann, committed such terrible things. So I wondered how you think that books and analysis such as Muslich, a bit more personal perhaps, can help us understand and relate to this past that seems so far away, but still very present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think reading about people who struggle to understand perpetrators, I think it's quite fascinating. And especially Muslich, as I said, he has this very empathetic, he's horrified by Eichmann at times, but he also has an empathetic reading. He wants to understand him. He doesn't want to believe, or he doesn't want to just take the word of the press that this man is evil and that's the only thing to say about him. He wants to understand. And he wants us to be aware that, Eichmann emerges from our own world. He's not out in some world out in a different universe, and he doesn't emerge from hell. He emerges from within our own midst. And, I think Sereni is another person who does that, who's really interested in kind of saying, how do these people who emerge in our own midst turn into perpetrators? How do they end up in this? Because that means that it could obviously be anyone that in your social circle under the right circumstances could potentially be a perpetrator, rather than sort of blanketly, collectively putting everyone in this group of Nazi, which in this, in the contemporary cultural moment isn't a historically accurate term at all, right? Nazi is a member of the National Socialist Party, but we just throw any kind of person involved in any kind of complicity as a Nazi, and therefore we just put them into that big category of we don't need to understand, we don't need to kind of see where there are moments that link up to our present day, that we might, that a person who takes pride in a job well done might be co-opted in such an enterprise as genocide, and like Eichmann, take pride in a job well done. I take pride in my work. One could co-opt that desire to please my superiors and please, and to be recognized professionally. One could co-opt that for pretty negative circumstances. And I think recognizing that, and there's some great work being done by sociologists and psychologists on the Holocaust that really thinking about that, the ways in which, very human character traits, very human psychological attitudes can, with the right conditions, be massaged into allowing people to become perpetrators, which is very different from the Nuremberg psychologists who were going in saying, what distinguishes these men for us? They wanted to kind of say, okay, there's something, they're sadistic or they're narcissistic or whatever, how they were trying to pathologize them. They were really trying to decide what can we attribute to them that is pathological, and therefore we don't have to worry about it. I think what's interesting now is that scholars are saying, okay, what do they have that is found in broad parts of the population? And under what conditions would those character and those psychological traits enable one to become a perpetrator?
Yeah, and also I think it's a very difficult balance to pinpoint like the things that are already in our society, like what we as a society already have that can enable us to become perpetrators, but also at the same time understanding that this particular person was a perpetrator. So it's a balance that is difficult. I mean, you
That's
have
right.
to put sociology, but also understand the individual, because the individual did something. Right?
That's right. Yes, and that's a very good point, is that this, just because Eichmann and I might share a character trait, doesn't mean that Eichmann didn't do what he did, and it doesn't mean that I'm a perpetrator, right? Like, I have not committed a violent crime, and he contributed to this massive genocide. So we do need to be historically specific, and not we can't also engage in kind of lazy or sloppy thinking that says, okay, well, we're all just potential Nazis, we're all potential perpetrators, we're all potential murderers. That's also not the case. So it's kind of between those poles, between they're the others and we would never become an other, to on the one hand, and the other side of the pole is, well, we're all just, given the right circumstances, we'd all become perpetrators. It's somewhere we have to kind of find that nuance between two binaries, which of course is what we're supposed to do as historians and cultural critics, is to collapse the binaries and really think about the nuances between them.
Yes, it's also very hard to do, right?
It is hard to do. And I mean, the funny thing is if you look at that image of Eichmann, all of the images of Eichmann, you do look at that. If you know that's Eichmann, you look at the face and you try to understand something from the face. This is why we have photography. This is why we have images. We see something and we hope to know something about a person from a photograph. That's hardwired in, evolutionarily speaking, into us as a species, that we try to read each other's face, movements, what we say. So we automatically do it. There's no way not to do it. It's just also something that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because Lucia has a question here. What do you think of the representations of Eichmann that are made in movies and films that deal with this person in general? It's actually, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the problem with perpetrators in film. I mean, it's a hard thing to get right, I have to say, because either you turn them into, like, and Eichmann is just, how do you represent the kind of guy that he was, which is, he was a little man, as Muslich said, he was a small man. And in some ways, it's a difficult thing to do. In two films in particular that I think do it well is I forget the name of the directors, Ronnie Brauman and Ayel Sival. It's called The Specialist, and it remediates the televisual footage of the Eichmann trial, but also in very interesting ways adds some artistic effects so that we're aware that it's it's a mediation, it's a representation, and it at certain points manipulates Eichmann's speech, so we become aware of the ways in which we kind of other Eichmann when we're watching him as that paradigmatic perpetrator. The other one that I think is really great is Hannah Arendt, the film Hannah Arendt, which never shows Eichmann as a person. It just shows you don't have an actor playing Eichmann. So they're not trying to naturalize it. It's still kind of keeping Eichmann as this kind of text, this historical text that has been written. Both of those do that in interesting ways. But I think it's a really hard topic. Another one that I actually like is called Conspiracy, which is it's a representation of the Wannsee Conference. And I think, but that's really focusing on the Eichmann during the Holocaust rather than the Eichmann at the trial, which is arguably a more interesting figure. But again, what's so interesting is we continue to make movies about Eichmann. We're continuing, books continue to appear. There's still a lot of work that's coming out on Eichmann in Jerusalem. And I think, there's some kind, he poses a really profound question for us in ways that some other perpetrators maybe don't pose.
We actually already recommended this movie on Hannah Arendt. It's very good. I wanted to address our audience because we're gonna, and you of course, we're gonna have an interview with Christopher Browning tomorrow. So you mentioned him several times. So we're gonna have an interview with him tomorrow, and he will talk about perpetrators also. And for the Brazilian audience, we're gonna have a roundtable about Hannah Arendt's work and its relevance today. So I think it really wraps up this conference very well. I would like also to thank you, Erin, because I don't want to take too much of your time. Thank you so much for being here and to talk to us today. It was amazing, as usual, to hear you talk. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Have a good afternoon.
Yes, you too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.